Hello and welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International. This is Robert L.D. Cooper with Mark A. Tabert. We are Magi. Our mission is to promote the highest standards in education, research and publications relating to the global phenomenon of Freemasonry.
The article by Natalie Bayer, titled Enlightenment or Counter-Enlightenment in Russia, Freemasons Writing History in the Late 18th Century. It appeared in the International Journal for History, Culture and Modernity, special issue, The Global Counter-Enlightenment, 1780 to 1960, in December of 2019, pages 1089 to 1120. Abstract. The article explores the themes of Enlightenment and Counter-Enlightenment through the lens of Freemasonry, and more specifically Freemasons in Russia who wrote history. It tests the approaches of Masonic history writers against Berlin's definitions of the Enlightenment and Counter-Enlightenment. While a definitive break between the Enlightenment and Counter-Enlightenment seems attractive, the article advances a more nuanced picture of the plurality of religious and secular discourse in Russia. Instead of opposing the Enlightenment, many late 18th century Masonic writers of history provided their own alternative interpretative models of history as a way out of the perceived crisis between the mind and the soul. Introduction. In 1786, Ivan Yelagin, the Russian provincial Grand Master, who had been patented by the Grand Lodge of England in 1772, began working on a book devoted to the history of Freemasonry and mystical doctrines, from ancient times up to the end of the 18th century. According to his plans, the book was designed to be an all-encompassing, as its title, Doctrine of Ancient Philosophy and Divine Knowledge, or Knowledge of Freemasons and Diverse Makers, Profane, Ecclesiastic, and Mystic, collected and presented in 5 parts by Ivan Yelagin, the Grand Master of the Russian Provincial Lodge. As a retired privy councillor and senator, Yelagin was able to devote a lot of his time to his project. But by 1788, he had only finished a part of what he had envisaged. To this day, the work has never been published, and it was probably only meant to be read by the members of the secret governing body of the so-called Second Yelagin Union that merged lodges loyal to Yelagin with those of the Swedish Rite that espoused a decidedly mystical outlook. Yelagin's history of Freemasonry not only includes the description of the degrees, but also his ideas on faith, religion, God, creation, the end of history, and discussions related to the Orthodox Christian tradition. This puzzling eschatological understanding of history permeates his work and is seen through the lens of the Kabbalistic and mystical sources, as well as Christian interpretations of the Old and New Testaments and of Russian history. As I established, this approach is characteristic of the way many Freemasons in Russia constructed their histories by the end of the 18th century. In the eyes of their contemporary critics, and in many later analyses, this approach consistently placed Freemasons on the fringes of the mainstream Enlightenment movement. Yelagin, for instance, started writing another large project called An Essay on the Tale About Russia, which was extensively criticized in Russia at the time for its antiquated literary style and fantastical interpretations of facts. Catherine II, a fellow amateur historian and an enthusiastic supporter of the so-called Voltaireanism, perceptively connected these shortcomings in Yelagin's Masonic interests in a letter to Grimm from the 12th of January 1794. She wrote, "As for Yelagin, he has died, and his history will probably remain unfinished. He left an incredible colossus of work related to Freemasonry, which proves that he had gone mad." It is well established that on an intellectual level, the rationalistically minded monarch who prided herself in carrying out personal correspondence with the leading figures of the European Enlightenment considered Masonic rituals and ceremonies to be absurd and contrary to reason. In her private correspondence, Catherine consistently treated Freemasonry as a disguised form of social climbing, aristocratic corporatist politics, and pseudo-religious ritualism that had lost touch with reality. She brought her private criticisms of the Masonic, I quote, stupidities and absurdities, end of quote, to the public level by publishing a series of plays in which she targeted fashionable interest in Western esotericism. While the Empress placed Freemasonry against the grain of the so-called rational Enlightenment movement, many Freemasons in Russia identified with the general confusion and perpetual search as indicative of the intellectual and emotional turmoil experienced by the educated Russian public in the second half of the 18th century. By the 1770s, the power of reason that people like Voltaire proposed, and in a way that served Russian Freemasonry in its early stages, became synonymous with moral nihilism and depravity. The majority of Russian Freemasons found the fraternity to be a crucible in which to resolve internal conflicts between their spiritual needs and the allure of the so-called Voltaireanism. Furthermore, by the late 18th century, Freemasons created a number of rites with varying ceremonies and degrees, which led to confusion about the uniformity of Masonic principles and rituals, and to conflicts among a myriad Masonic affiliations. The differences between the rites, which were often identified with the national allegiances of their propagators, became increasingly muddled throughout the century. As a result, by the end of the century, Russian Freemasons had a vast and nuanced variety of models on offer, from the 3-degree English version of Freemasonry, with its support of the established political and religious order of constitutional monarchy and tendency towards practicality and rationalism, to the various high-degree rites that espoused elements of the so-called Western esotericism. Given this variety, confusion about national origins, and the personal intellectual predispositions, it is difficult, if not impossible, to generalize about a group identity of the intellectuals involved. However, I would argue that the growing fear throughout the 18th century vis-à-vis the likelihood that rational philosophy would undermine moral values and lead Russian society to total depravity became one of the leitmotifs in the writings of Freemasons in Russia, and this is reflected prominently in their writings in history. As I explore the themes of Enlightenment and Counter-Enlightenment through the lens of Freemasonry, and more specifically Freemasons in Russia who wrote history, I shall test the approaches of Masonic history writers against Isaiah Berlin's definition of the Enlightenment as a tradition and a movement with the central doctrine rooted in the belief that, quote, human nature was fundamentally the same in all times and places, end of quote, and that, quote, a logically constructed structure of laws and generalizations susceptible of demonstration and verification could be constructed on the basis of methods similar to that of Newtonian physics. While the definitive break between the Enlightenment and Counter-Enlightenment seems attractive in its diametrical stance, I would like to advance a more nuanced picture of the plurality of religious and secular discourse in Russia by interpreting, quote, a dialectical but not antithetical conception of the Enlightenment and of its critics. As I argue, instead of opposing the Enlightenment, the late 18th century Masonic writers of history, whom I consider here, provided their own alternative interpretive models of history as a way out of the perceived crisis between the mind and the soul. Isaiah Berlin's Counter-Enlightenment through the lens of history of Freemasonry. Leo Tolstoy's epic War and Peace, 1865 to 1869, contains one of the best-known intellectual and spiritual journeys towards initiation into Freemasonry in 19th century literature. A Russian nobleman, Pierre Bezukhov, is going through a deep crisis when he meets a charismatic Mason, Bazdeev, who invites Pierre to join the Society of Freemasons. Feeling frustrated by his current spiritual and emotional life, Pierre hopes that the Brotherhood will provide him with answers to the quintessential questions about the meaning of life. On a practical level, he sees Freemasonry as a means of devoting his life to serving humanity. These hopes do not come to fruition for Pierre. Instead of charting a path to enlightenment, early 19th century Russian Freemasonry, as portrayed by Tolstoy, is an elitist organization that encourages its members to participate in bizarre rituals shrouded in mysticism. The latter is a poignant criticism for Tolstoy. Far from embracing a Masonic worldview and ritual, the writer uses Bezukhov's journey within Freemasonry to demonstrate a false way out of a crisis of discord between reason and spirituality. Tolstoy's depiction of Freemasonry in War and Peace can be seen as one particular instance of his interest in the interplay between subjectivity and objectivity and between human agency and laws and history. According to Morton White, throughout the work, Tolstoy, quote, asks what he calls two fundamental questions. What is historical force or power, and what force or power produces the movement of nations? End of quote. The first is addressed through a definition of force modeled on Newtonian physics. Quote, power is the relation of a given person to other individuals in which the more this person expresses opinions, predictions, and justifications of the collective action that is performed, the less is his participation in that action. End of quote. Relating force and movement, in answering the second question, he postulates, quote, the movement of nations is caused by the activity of all the people who participate in the events and who always combine in such a way that those taking the largest direct share in the event take on themselves the least responsibility and vice versa. End of quote. It is this individual action multiplied that causes breaks in the fabric of history, revolutions, and wars. Just as laws and physics are able to chart the connection between a cause and an effect in a deterministic way, so too can one trace the laws of history. A non-deterministic approach is unthinkable for Tolstoy in history. As White indicates in the concluding sessions of the epilogue, and also in, quote, Some Words About War and Peace, published in 1868, Tolstoy, quote, explicitly defends determinism as inevitable necessity, end of quote. So when Isaiah Berlin considers Tolstoy's early vision of history, he points out in a similar way, quote, history alone, the sum of empirically discoverable data, held the key to the mystery of why what happened as it did and not otherwise, and only history consequently could throw light on the fundamental ethical problems which obsessed him, Tolstoy, as it did every Russian thinker in the 19th century. What is to be done? How should one live? Why are we here? What must we be and do? The study of historical connections and the demand for empirical answers to these проклятые вопросы, cursed questions, became infused into one in Tolstoy's mind, as his early diaries and letters show very vividly. End of quote. Berlin claims, however, that Tolstoy's sense of reality would eventually translate into a large picture view of causal determinism. Quote, Tolstoy's central thesis is that there is a natural law whereby the lives of human beings no less than those of nature are determined, but that men, unable to face this inexorable process, seek to represent it as a succession of free choices. End of quote. It is not surprising, then, then when Berlin relates his vision of Tolstoy's theory of history to how Freemasonry is presented in War and Peace, he confidently concludes, quote, Tolstoy stood at the opposite pole to all this. He was against unintelligible mysteries, against mists of antiquity, against any kind of recourse to mumbo-jumbo. His hostile picture of Freemasons in War and Peace remains symptomatic of his attitude to the end. End of quote. In the same way as Berlin swiftly connects the, quote, innate conservatism of Tolstoy's outlook with natural anti-intellectualism and anti-liberalism, end of quote, he also relates an emphasis on cultural differences and protests against the authority of timeless general laws and rules. If Tolstoy's perceived conservatism goes hand in hand with a mistrust of homogeneous cosmopolitanism, this then provides another reason for Tolstoy's charge against an institution that claims to unite men into a universal brotherhood. When this attitude towards Freemasonry is put against the historical context of the Great Patriotic War of 1812, it is the early Russian conservatives who make heightened accusations against Russian Freemasons as foreign agents who are corrupting fellow Russians with irreligious ideas and subverting the war efforts of true Russian patriots. Tolstoy places the story of a Russian nobleman's embrace of Freemasonry at the beginning of the 19th century, yet in reality, the protagonist's spiritual journey towards Freemasonry is more redolent of earlier generations of Russian intellectuals who tried to reconcile traditional Russian values with the confusing stream of ideas coming from the West in the second half of the 18th century. In 18th century Russia, Freemasonry was intertwined with the country's westernization and effectively became one of its active agents.